Hello, this is video number 5 for week 1, and today we're talking about anthropology and culture. What is culture? How do anthropologists define it? How do they use it? What are some ramifications of that definition for what we do in the field? Hopefully you'll learn all of that in this video. So first, what is culture? Well, culture is a word we throw around a lot in common parlance, but anthropologists have some very specific aspects of it that are important to them. And there are 4 different aspects. Culture is learned, it's shared and negotiated, it's integrated or patterned, and it's symbolic. And something has to have all of these in order to be considered truly culture. So first, culture is learned. It's passed from generation to generation and learned through enculturation. All right, we'll talk about these in more depth on Thursday during our discussion, so I won't say too much now, but just some things to think about here is that culture is learned. So culture is not something you're born with. You're a baby in the womb and culture begins to act on you when you're born. Actually, guess what? It begins to act on you in the womb. There's been some really interesting research lately that has shown that when babies are born, they cry in tones that are specific to the language they've been hearing while in the womb. So an American baby's cries sounds different from a Chinese baby's cries because Chinese Mandarin is a tonal language and English is not. So there are different kinds of sounds associated with that crying. So culture is acting on us before we're born, but the point is we're not made with culture already put into us innately. We learn it from others, from previous generations in particular. So something fun to think about for our discussion on Thursday is where have you learned your culture? What are the individuals and the institutions that have taught and reinforced your culture to you? Secondly, culture is shared and negotiated. It's shared by all members of a group, so it's not individual based, and its meanings are negotiated by them. So as an individual, you have a lot of different cultures in you, but you cannot be an individual member, one member of one culture. Culture has to be shared with other people because it's symbolic, which we'll get to in just a second. So culture is shared, it's passed down, it's taught to, new members as they grow up into it. But the meanings of culture are negotiated by members of that group. And that's why culture can change over time, because a few members of that culture start coming up with different ideas of what they think culture means. And they negotiate and renegotiate those over time. So culture can change. Third, culture is integrated or patterned. It's not haphazardly put together, but it's patterned and integrated into a whole. This is why anthropology, cultural anthropology, seeks to be holistic in its study of culture, because everything only makes sense together. If you take out one aspect, like rituals, and just try to study those alone, they really can't make sense unless you have the whole sense of culture and how they fit into that. We'll look at lots of examples of that throughout the semester. Finally, culture is symbolic. Culture imbues or gives to nature, behaviors, practices, events, words, objects, and everything else symbolic meanings that then inform our thoughts and actions. So we act on the things in our world because culture has told us how to act on those things in the world. And so these are the symbols, the meanings behind aspects of our lives that are shared and negotiated with other people, that are integrated and patterned into a whole, and then that are taught through this process of enculturation. So see, these 4 aspects work together, and we can put them together into one big definition of culture. Now, an earlier view of culture, if you had taken this class 100 years ago, this would have been the definition, which was given to us by E.B. Tylor, who was another social evolutionist. For him and other social evolutionists, culture, or what they called civilization, because they believed that savages and barbarians didn't really have culture. Culture, or civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Now, this is a pretty good definition of culture, But look at its focus. Its focus is on the products of culture rather than the meanings behind those products. So this is what allowed social evolutionists to go to a museum and look at weapon styles, clothing styles, other kinds of material aspects of the group, of the life of a group of people, and then say, oh, well, these things are at the barbarian level. That's how we'll classify them. What they didn't do was think, why are the weapons like this? Why does the clothing look like this? How do these show what this group of people thinks about the world and its place in it? Our updated definition of culture does try to explain the why and the how behind aspects of culture. So our definition is something more like culture is an integrated, patterned system of behaviors, practices, beliefs, customs, relationships, etc., with symbolic meanings that are shared and negotiated by members of a group and passed on through enculturation. So this neat little definition has all four of those aspects included in it. So the earlier view of culture was of culture as bounded. So you would talk about American culture, or Junhuazi culture, or Inuit culture, or indigenous culture, or something like that. And it was as if really culture was the same thing as a society. It was the whole set of stuff that that society produced. Today, we see culture as a more fluid and flexible and less bounded set of beliefs and practices that can change over time. And that might not be shared 100% by everyone in that group. So even though many of us here can say that we're part of American culture, we might be very different kinds of Americans with very different experiences at the same time that we would recognize ourselves as being part of American culture. See the difference? Okay, so there are a couple, actually three things I want to say about culture and what this definition means for our method as cultural anthropologists. So, ethnocentrism, first of all, is the tendency to view the world, sometimes exclusively, from the basis of one's own experience. Now, ethnocentrism has a kind of negative connotation, but it's natural. It's what we do. I think it's a survival instinct. We see the world through our own lens. We think of ourselves first. We understand others' experiences through our own. It's a natural thing to do. But, as you can imagine, it causes problems for an anthropologist who's trying to understand others' experiences and kind of needs to get rid of some of that ethnocentrism. So this is why Boas offered his paradigm of cultural relativity, which, as a reminder, is the idea that each society or culture must be understood on its own terms, not those of outsiders. So the outsider is me. If I go and study Moroccan society, I have to try to understand Moroccans on their own terms, not be thinking of them on American terms. So anthropologists turned cultural relativity into a tool called cultural relativism. And that is the idea that we should suspend our judgments about the value of other people's customs and consider first the role that those customs fulfill within the culture in which they are found. Okay? So if we go into another society, like let's say I studied women's rights in Morocco. You'll hear a lot about that this semester. And let's say I went to Morocco and studied these women's rights organizations, and I just kept thinking, well, Islam's not as good as Christianity, and these laws are not as good as American laws, and these people don't understand what the role of women should be according to how Americans understand it since the 1960s and 1970s, and these people do that, and that's wrong. That wouldn't get me very far as an anthropologist, would it? Now, what if I suspend all of those judgments and I simply ask questions like, why do you believe that? Why are you doing it that way? What does that mean? What's the history of that law? Why do you feel that women should live this kind of life? Help me see the world from your own point of view so I can understand it. That's cultural relativism. It's just that suspension of judgment so that we can understand. Now, cultural relativism gets, what's the word? I'm forgetting my words. It gets conflated today in common parlance with moral relativism. So critics accuse anthropologists of moral relativism, and that's an ideology that we should never make moral judgments about other individuals and societies, that we should suspend our lens of judgment, or suspend our judgments to the point where we say anything goes. You know, if those people want to physically abuse other people, that's their business. If this society wants to deny human rights to this minority group, fine with me, it's their culture. Even these critics have made the ridiculous accusation that cultural relativism could be applied to the Holocaust by saying, well, gosh, the Nazis wanted to exterminate millions and millions of people. Well, that was their culture, so I guess there's nothing I can say about it. And that's ridiculous. That's not what cultural relativism is. Cultural relativism is simply a tool that allows us to suspend our judgment so that we can understand. And then perhaps down the road, make better judgments about certain kinds of practices. So anthropologists, I know, all try to keep an open mind in the field when they're studying certain things. But at some point along the way, after they have studied them and come to understand them, they sometimes let themselves make moral judgments about those practices. So, for example, a feminist anthropologist might eventually say, I disagree with this practice. I think this practice is problematic and troublesome from a women's human rights perspective. But I understand it better because when I was in the field, I suspended that judgment and I just tried to understand that practice in its own terms. So make sure you understand these terms and how they fit together, and try to understand how cultural relativism is different from moral relativism. And we can talk about that on Thursday. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.